to our webinar on advocacy burnout. My name is Charles Gardner. I'm the executive director of INNCO, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the rights and well-being of 98 million adults worldwide who use safer nicotine. Most of them are ex-smokers, to avoid toxic forms of tobacco. But we have much broader interests. And we have a great lineup today of speakers, and then we'll have a panel discussion. I want to recognize and welcome all of you because we have we've experienced a lot more interest in this webinar than we initially expected, and we have people here from a wide variety of different fields, including LGBTQ rights, from health advocacy more broadly, some government representatives. And they're from all over the world. It's a very international crowd. You are all welcome, including people who don't agree with us. And I hope we may hear some voices and some questions from them. I have worn a number of different hats before we get on to Ethan Nadelmann and then Nicholas Green and Eli Rubashkyn and Nancy Lucas. Quick dive, talking about advocacy in the health space. Very early 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association decided that homosexuality was a disease. And they honestly thought that they were doing people in that community a favor by taking it out of the moral space and switching it over into a medicalization of that behavior. And it didn't go over very well, but advocates began to tilt the needle there, and they succeeded. And they succeeded in a two-pronged approach. First of all, it turned out that a lot of people in that professional society were what we now call LGBTQ people. And they began coffee table discussions about how they were going to change that policy. At the same time, there were some quite radical demonstrations, breaking up scientific meetings, for example. And it was a kind of two-pronged approach that succeeded, so that that professional society and pretty much most of the world in general no longer considers that normal behavior to be a disease, thank heavens. In my case, I used to work for an organization called the Global Forum for Health Research and had a senior position there. It's closely affiliated with the World Health Organization and based in Geneva. And I was an advocate, so for several years in global health research. And our goal was to get the high-income countries to spend more money on the diseases that affect 90% of the world's population. So we talked about something called the 1090 gap, but also to get low and middle-income countries to spend more money on the diseases affecting their populations. I did not feel burnout because we were succeeding. I did not feel burnout because we were making progress. But in many other fields of global health, of human rights, of LGBTQ advocacy, and on and on and on, it very often feels like we're taking two steps forward and one step back. And that leads many people, including people in my community who've been doing this for 10 years with no pay, to start to talk about, I'm just feeling burned out. Like every day there's a new bad story that doesn't matter how many times you try to confront the myths, they keep coming back. And so we want to talk about that and how we can all help each other to address these very normal human feelings. And again, we welcome everyone to this discussion. It's not going to be focused exclusively on any particular area. This is about advocacy. and we welcome all questions. So I'm gonna really drop out quickly here and turn this over to the great Ethan Nadelmann, founder of the Drug Policy Alliance. And Ethan, over to you.
Thanks, Charles. And actually more relevant for current listeners, host of the podcast, Psychoactive. So I hope you're all tuned into that. So Charles asked me to join this. I've never given a talk about burnout before, but I've thought a lot about it, and not so much for myself. I mean, I was involved, and I have been involved in advocating to end the war on drugs and advancing harm reduction vis-a-vis illicit drugs for about 35 years. You know, during that period, there's been a lot of successes and also a lot of disappointments. And for me, I've been in a situation that's quite different than many, if not all of you, tuning into this, which is that I came from a fairly privileged position of being in an elite university where my salary was paid, and then being able to, build an organization and raise money from very wealthy guys. So for me, the greatest issues around burnout were really around dealing with annual budgets and fundraising, and especially dealing with an ever-growing staff. I mean, there's sort of problems that I think many of you wish you could one day have, and they're difficult and they're challenging. But I don't think I ever, I didn't experience major phases of burnout, sort of a week during each summer when I'd ask myself, how much longer do I want to do this? And then when I finally got to a point about 6-7 years ago where I realized that it might be time for me to step aside, I was able to plan it out. But in the role I played, both building my organization and playing a role in building a broader drug policy reform movement that included a lot of grant making and allying and assisting lots of grassroots activists around the world, not just in the U.S., but globally, I perceived and learned a few things, I think. I want to share that. And I want to put it in the context, really, of what it means to be, building a movement of ultimately aiming to win and doing it in as constructive a way as possible. So, I start off with the presumption that one of the great advantages that all of us have is that, I say all of us, I'm assuming all of those who are advocating for harm reduction vis-a-vis licit or illicit drugs, tobacco or other drugs, or even fighting for human rights, whatever in that area, is that we know without a doubt that we are on the right side. I mean, it's almost like we're religious missionaries, except we got the science behind us. You know what I mean? I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you're advocating for harm reduction, the science is there. We know we have it. We know that the large majority of the scientific consensus, to the extent there's any objectivity to it, is behind us. We know that we have information that makes sense. We know that the opposition to harm reduction, the framing by our opponents, no matter how powerful they are, the World Health Organization, the Bloomberg Foundations, all of the other powerful entities that are pushing this stuff, that we're on the side of right and justice, right? So we have the science on our side, and we have the human rights on our side. And that means that, although there are little things around the edges where we have to stop and, check ourselves and ask certain questions, it gives us this great advantage. It means that we can look our kids in the eye at night and say, I'm not just out there trying to make an extra buck. I'm not out there trying to screw somebody. I'm actually there trying to make this a better world and save people's lives and advance public health and science and human rights and compassion. And that's an incredibly empowering position. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the value of being in that position. So that's start off. I mean, that's a great advantage we have. The other side may believe in what they have going for them, but the fact of the matter is they have to engage in a lot more cognitive dissonance, given how much of the scientific evidence is on our side and how much of the human rights side element of this thing is on our side. Now, the second thing I would say is, and some of this is advice as much about advocacy as about avoiding burnout, which is that as I was starting, a few friends of mine suggested, this is as I was shifting from being an academic to getting involved full-time in activism, a few friends of mine suggested I meet with a fellow named Ram Dass. Some of you may have heard of him, sort of a spiritual guru guide, came out of alternative thinking about drugs, but also the kind of guy that, corporations would pay a lot of money to come and talk at their annual retreats. And I went to see him, and I told him I had this great opportunity now to get into full-time activism. I'd secured a major donor, and I asked her for his advice. And he said to me, he gave me two pieces of advice. And the first one was, Ethan, you need to learn to love William Bennett. Now, most of you probably won't know who William Bennett was, but William Bennett was the first drug czar in America in 1989 at the height of the kind of hysterical drug war, highly punitive, evil drug war. And William Bennett, to my mind, represents kind of pure evil. I mean, this is a person advocating death penalties and mass incarceration and promoting all sorts of vicious lies. He was almost like the Putin of the drug war as far as I'm concerned. And Ram Dass is saying to me, Ethan, you want to succeed, you have to learn to love him. And I kind of laughed, but I knew what he meant, I think, which was that for us to win, for us to prevail in our advocacy and changing the political and legal context and public context, it means that we have to win over the people, not our most virulent opponents, but all the people who are worried about what it is we're saying, all the people who worry about their kids getting into smoking, all the people who think this is only about us being shills for a tobacco industry when in fact nobody's getting any money from them. I mean, all this sort of stuff. But it means that element of empathy, of having this sense of empathy for people who don't get right now what we're trying to advocate for is absolutely pivotal. So just keep that first thing in mind, right? There's our opponents, but then there's the mass of humanity that's really on the fence or ambivalent or leaning the other way, and they're really who we're trying to reach on this thing. The second thing he said to me is, let go of your attachment let go of your attachment to the goals that you're fighting for. And what I took that to mean is that win or lose, committing hours, days, weeks, months, years of our life to this cause, whether or not we ultimately prevail in our lifetimes, it's still the right thing to do because we're fighting the good fight, right? We're fighting the good fight. So don't despair if we're not making progress. Just know that you're involved in the good fight. Now, that said, the question becomes, if we're involved in the good fight, how do we increase the odds we actually win? Right. And that where I think the most important thing, is basically understanding that as we begin to build a sort of movement, as we're doing that oftentimes the most difficult challenges and the most frustrating things and the things that get us most angry oftentimes aren't our opponents or the establishment advocating for all this anti-harm reduction, anti-human rights type stuff. It's our allies. It's the people we agree with on the broader objectives. It's the people we fight with over tactics and strategies and girlfriends and boyfriends and funding and credit and all of this sort of stuff. That's almost in the nature of things. That it's the people who are working right next to you or that you see all the time that you're becoming allies with them, not because you're necessarily friends, but because you need to work together. And that's what I think is absolutely pivotally important to basically, the expression, keep our eye on the prize. It's a phrase from Martin Luther King. Keep our eye on the prize about victory, what victory means. And it means that, part it means in practice is the less time you spend getting involved in disputes over tactics, strategy, principles, whatever, with your allies, the better. I would always tell my staff, don't get involved in all these little debates on Twitter or email or whatever it is about little this and that and definitional things and language things like that. Forget it. Let people debate on that sort of stuff. Let's keep our eye on the public facing strategy. Keep our eye outward. Keep our eye looking, in that sense that we need to stay focused and minimize, all of that, internal stuff that's not actually changing anybody's minds out there. And then the last thing I just wanted to say here was that, the question becomes, how do we engage in elements of sustaining ourselves? I mean, if you can stay in this cause, it's going to be a multi-generational struggle. No question about it. Just, I sometimes think about the struggle and the war on drugs is, maybe a 3-generation struggle. And we're now kind of into the second generation of this thing. And we've had some big victories like in marijuana, and we've managed to spread illicit drug harm reduction. We managed to roll back incarceration in my country and a bunch of others. But long way to go. So you want to think about this in the long term. And that means being willing, I mean, really to obviously take care of yourself. I mean, other people will probably say this, but it's we can get passionate about these things and we forget to go outside. We spend our whole day in the apartment without ever going outside. We forget to take a break. Sometimes, it was a saving grace for me that often, just spending from Friday night to Sunday morning, just not doing anything about drugs or thinking about the work, just having a concrete break, a Sabbath, the beautiful idea of the Sabbath as applied to, our advocacy work, right? I mean, it's what you need to do to just take that break, find something different. As sometimes you'll find yourself just getting tired of just saying the same sorts of things. So doing that sort of thing, but it's also at the same time, sometimes I would evaluate my mental health by, on the weekend, how much time did I spend engaged in unpleasant thinking or emotional angst about my work, right? It was fine to think about drug policy and all this sort of stuff if it was fun thinking about it, talking about it. But to the extent it brought up feelings of anxiety, I needed that time where I would have 36 hours a week or something where I could just disconnect myself from that so I could take a breath and distract myself, do something else and, be with my daughter or, go to just something other. But the last thing I want to say is that, when you're committed to advocacy, each one of us is a different personality. I mean, we come from different places politically. We come from different places in terms of our broader, the way we interact with people, what we like to do, what we don't like to do. Some of us are good at writing, some at speaking, some are better at arguing, some of us are shy. I mean, you name it. There's something about advocacy where you should think about it, I think, in two different ways. One is that how do you take what you and hopefully others see as the strengths of your personality and use those to advantage in your advocacy? What are the things you're good at? What are the things where you can carve out a niche that can be useful to others? How do you play to your strengths in a way? Because obviously playing to your strengths enables you to build on things you're already naturally good at. And typically that's a case of not feeling burned out from that. But then there's a second piece of this stuff, which is what about the areas you're not good at? What about the areas that don't play to your strengths? What about the things that you're afraid of? Well, here's where being attached to this greater cause, which I regard as a blessing, any of us involved in these movements, it's a blessing to have this type of emotional, political, principled connection to a broader cause like this. Well, the question is how do you use that commitment to help push yourself out of your comfort zone? How do you do it to try to grow in your personality? If you're somebody who's shy, how do you find here the opportunity to actually be a little less shy, to force yourself to speak publicly, to force yourself to reach out to politicians or journalists where you might not even think to do it because you're asking, why would you do that? If you're somebody who's highly argumentative, well, here's the opportunity to sometimes step back and say, I love arguing, but where can I try to cultivate my abilities for communicating in non-argumentative ways, whether it's with allies or whether it's with a broad, outward group that we're trying to influence? There's looking at those opportunities to grow. One thing I knew is that as the opportunities emerged for me to go from being an individual academic advocating for reform to build an organization, a political movement, I was called on to do all sorts of things that I had no experience on and that I never thought I had any gifts for, whether it was raising money or managing a staff or meeting budgets or, a whole host of things. But, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. What you realize is if you want to succeed in your own life and if you want this broader movement to succeed, well, that means stretching yourself, getting out of your comfort zone, being willing to take criticism and digest it and think about it honestly and be willing to do stuff you never imagined you were doing because that's what's required to build this movement. So I'm going to stop there and I look forward to joining the Q&A at the end of all the other presentations. Thanks a lot.
So thank you so much, Ethan. And I really want to compliment you on on your podcast, your new podcast, Psychoactive. It's actually incredibly interesting, well worth listening to for anyone. Ethan, I'm going to ask my question, and then Jeff is going to help us with a question from the audience. Ethan, one of the first policies of this new administration in the United States, which is, it's just one country, was a strategy on drug harm reduction. And this is primarily focused on opioids because we're in a huge panic over opioid use. And the president himself in the State of the Union address 2 nights ago actually said the words harm reduction. And the fact that that's happened, I think, is in part due to your work in the past and the work of the Drug Policy Alliance and thousands of advocates that you helped to energize at the DPA. That's fantastic. Another area where we've seen some progress in the drug harm reduction space is in the use of cannabis and cannabinoids. And so the kind of pointed question I want to ask you is about how did the cannabis community, which is not my community, but I have nothing against it, how did they react when the idea of medical marijuana was first introduced?
It's basically, I don't know how much it goes to the theme of burnout, but basically there was really a split. There were some people who thought that medical marijuana should move forward totally independently of broader marijuana legalization and dissociated themselves from broader marijuana legalization. There were other people who had been advocating for marijuana legalization who did not like the kind of incremental medical marijuana strategy. They felt that it might peel off the most sympathetic victims of the war on marijuana and that it would, maybe put things into a medicalized framework that would ultimately put things backward. And then there were the people like me who, fortunately we had the resources, who basically saw the medical marijuana thing in through both frames. We saw it as something that sort of stood in its own right. And we believed that those people who are using marijuana medically as opposed to purely recreationally had a moral right to be first in line to obtain the legal right to use cannabis without fear of the government's, putting them in jail. So we thought that, but then separately, we also thought that opening up the public discussion around medical marijuana, where we already had majority sympathy on our side, would help to change the broader public dialogue around marijuana legalization. And we thought that was likely the case, and it turned out in retrospect to, in fact, be the case, that by opening up a broader dialogue on medical marijuana, it changed public opinion much more broadly. But Charles, just to the theme here, we had to be conscious around this stuff with medical marijuana because sometimes the most powerful advocates were people who were living with multiple sclerosis or living with AIDS, wasting syndrome, or other conditions where marijuana was really like a lifesaver for them. It was helping them to keep moved, to reduce their pain. And we wanted them to be out front. But sometimes that imposed a real strain on them. To have somebody who's dealing with MS, be wheeling into a legislative hearing or things like that, or advocacy thing, it galvanized them personally, but sometimes they would just be wiped out after that. And so it's understanding, sometimes it's like when we think about, what happened with the Marlboro Man commercials and when then he has cancer and he becomes one of the great ads, right? The Marlboro Man with lung cancer, right? Well, if you think about it, having a comparable ad of somebody who was struggling and then is saying not just stop smoking, but vape instead, but you have to be aware that sometimes people are, who are already sick, they're your best allies. They're the ones who most pull on the heartstrings if people are otherwise opposed to you. So you want them out front, but you also want to make sure they're not actually driving themselves into the ground.
Yeah, I think, so advocates feel burnout when they feel like they're not making progress. And in a way, so part of my question is just like, how did those human stories help tilt the needle? In my opinion, that was a very important way to actually harness evidence and put human stories into the public discourse. So the public saw people, the journalists saw.
Well, I'll give you one example, Charles. I remember a very powerful op-ed. It was written, I think, by a Korean-American woman whose mother was dying in the hospital. And everybody, even the physicians, were saying, use cannabis to deal with the nausea that you're dealing with and some of their symptoms. And she said, I absolutely refuse. I will not go to my death, using these drugs, right? And died a more painful death, and maybe a death that was a little sooner because she was in such pain and discomfort, right? Well, it's the same thing if you think about the advocate who can, who can personalize this thing, who can, the person who is dying of cancer and said, I wish I had the opportunity to do this thing. The child who lost their parents to cancer, this U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, who should be on the right side of this issue, is on the wrong side of the issue. He goes, I'm against this issue because my parents died of lung cancer. Well, my dad probably died of smoking-related disease as well, but it puts me on the other side. So it's kind of that stuff, and it's the humanizing element of this thing. Now, we had that with medical marijuana. I remember with advocating for needle exchange. We had somebody who lost her father to, I think maybe actually a Miss America or maybe a Miss New Jersey winner or something like that. Or somebody had lost their father to AIDS from injecting drug use, and she was right out there saying needle exchange could have saved my life. Hard-ass Republicans, when we were working to reform these very punitive drug laws, we brought in the kids of the people who were incarcerated to say, why is my parent in prison for longer than rapists and murderers are when all she did was sell some drugs to another adult? Why did she get 20 years and not a couple of years? Why isn't she home with me? So it's those sorts of things where you kind of, you can even pull on the heartstrings of the most callous people who are out there. And I mean, Charles, the fact of the matter is when you feel like we're making no progress or that we're banging our heads against the wall, ultimately reform, it's about incremental. It's one person at a time. It's one journalist at a time. It's one politician at a time. I think one thing that most activists fail to do is to realize that there's no wall that says they cannot contact their local legislator. Right? There's no wall that says you can't contact a journalist. You are perfectly free to write an email or call up and say, let me just provide you the evidence, and do it nicely. I think you made a mistake here. Here's the actual evidence. Or to contact the legislator and just keep persisting and saying, I'm your constituent. I need you to meet with me. I need you to meet with me. And then to go in there with the facts and the figures, right? To have the information so you can hand them that in an accessible form, and what keeps every independent, unpaid activist from doing that? Oftentimes it's just a sense of feeling disempowered or feeling shy or whatever. But I'll tell you, one of the famous quotes is that Margaret Mead or something, all it takes to change the world is an individual. I can't remember exactly what the quote is of the person. But the fact of the matter is the individuals who are the most dedicated and creative and resourceful and willing to, not take no for an answer and to use their strengths, to engage. I mean, the fact of the matter is each little success like that, on an individual, an audience, a jurisdiction, it's what keeps you going.
Yeah. God, thank you. So I want to introduce Jeff Zamora here. So Jeff is the director of social media for INNCO, and it's kind of like if I'm the facilitator here, then Jeff is he's here to kick me into keeping this on track. And so I'm going to ask Jeff, do we have any question from the audience for Ethan?
Well, actually, there's a common concern and actually expressed by Mallory Gates, where she talks about how to deal with repetition when it comes to myth busting. And I'm pretty sure that on drugs, harm reduction is something that is still present to this day. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with repetition of myth busting?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, one of the things is that you sometimes think that one way that Ronald Reagan became the president of the United States was because he was an actor. And what that meant was that he was good at saying the same thing over and over and over, like 100,000 times, and always making it sound fresh each time. I, as a kind of professor, get bored of saying the same thing over and over, and I would constantly be changing it around. But Ronald Reagan had the right idea that just as the other side constantly repeats their things, we have to be ready to keep repeating our things over and over and over and over again as well. Now, that said, understand that many people incorrectly define advocacy as just standing up and saying what I believe, what I think, what I know, however I think I should say it. But, what we learned and what we sort of know instinctively is that that doesn't help if it's not persuading anybody or if it's alienating people. It means that when you're out there, you need to be thinking about what are the specific words that I can use that will help move people on the other side. There was a point where we knew that saying legalize marijuana would alienate people. But if you said make it legal, drop that hard Z on legalize, you picked up your support from the public opinion. And if instead of saying the word legal at all, you just said, let's treat it like alcohol, tax control, regulate and educate, well, you got even more support. So figuring out the right language, the right tone, those are the sorts of things where we can keep coming back at the other. Look, right now, this is very much a David versus Goliath battle. And our opposition tries to paint the role of the tobacco companies, big tobacco, as making this about they're the David and that's the Goliath. But we know they're fucking lying. Right. We know that this whole advocacy movement for harm reduction basically, is essentially an unfunded movement at this point. Right. So what it means is it's just not engaging in the same repetition the other side does, but getting ever better at our languaging, trying to understand that framing in certain ways into certain audiences is more likely to prevail than is just saying what we believe. For me, the core principle of drug policy reform and harm reduction is that no one should be punished for what we put in our bodies if we don't hurt anybody else. That's the core principle. But I almost never lead with that principle. I lead with arguments that I know that people in the middle who don't care about my principle may embrace. And then maybe I pull my core principle of sovereignty and liberty and freedom at the end. But I don't lead with it.
Wow. So thank you so much, Ethan. I'm going to move then quickly to, that was tremendous. I'm going to move quickly then to Nicholas Green, who is a tireless advocate for a decade in the field of what I'm most of the people in my community don't like this, but which I'm starting to call nicotine harm reduction, because you know what? Nicotine is a psychoactive drug like caffeine and alcohol and others, but it's different. Like every psychoactive drug is different. So, Nicholas, you've been doing this for a lot longer than I have, because I've only come into this space 3 years ago, and but you and I've talked, and you have a big presence in this field, and I want to hear. How do you, what do you want to say about what we normally call tobacco harm reduction or nicotine harm reduction? By the way, I'm saying this because in the field of opioid harm reduction, we don't call it, opium comes from poppies. It's a flower, right?
Sure.
We don't call it poppy harm reduction. So why are we calling it tobacco harm reduction? But actually, most people in my community think I'm an idiot for saying that. But I'm going to turn this over to you.
I certainly wouldn't call you an idiot for saying that, not in any capacity. I'm probably at this point still going to use the term tobacco harm reduction, or maybe we should say combustion harm reduction. Maybe that's more accurate. Maybe not. But, like Charles said, my entire background and history in this is just with vaping, just with tobacco harm reduction. I'm probably the least qualified person to be on this panel, and especially following the greatness that we all just heard from Ethan Nadelmann. So with that said, I can really only speak to my experience with this. I switched from smoking to vaping in 2009, and I spent that first year being very wide-eyed, very optimistic, thinking this is a miracle. All of these smokers are suddenly going to have this great alternative, and we need to tell everybody about this. And then it was about a year later in 2010, I became pretty radicalized because California had some legislation to ban vaping, just blanket completely and thoroughly banned vaping in the state of California. And I remember nobody was really talking about it, and it wasn't on any forums. And so I just made this quick little video kind of talking about, hey guys, I think California wants to ban vaping. I feel like maybe we should probably do something about this. I don't know what we can do, but we kind of need to do something. It ended up getting vetoed, but that little brush with advocacy and activism and seeing that, oh, this is something that's going to get attacked, that it kind of instantly radicalized me and made me realize that, yeah, we're going to have a long sort of struggle and battle ahead of us to legitimize vaping for people who smoke. And to me, I mean, burnout feels like you're just climbing a mountain, by yourself. You're not by yourself, but it kind of makes you feel like you're climbing a mountain by yourself. And maybe in the beginning, back in 2010, we could see the top of the mountain and go, look, we just have to get there. Right there. Safe, legal, accessible for all smokers. There's the goal. There's the top of the mountain. It looks like we could get there. And then over the years, throughout 2014 and 15 and 16, and we see the FDA deeming regulations, and we see these constantly being attacked, and taxes and flavor bans. It just feels like the mountain just keeps getting steeper and steeper and steeper. And you go, we're still climbing. We're still going. Who's tired? We're all tired. Let's keep climbing the mountain. And you just kept climbing it and kept climbing it. And now I feel like we're getting to the point where we're still climbing the mountain. Of course we're climbing the mountain because, as echo what Ethan Nadelmann said, we have all the science on our side. It's very clear. We're climbing this mountain. And now there's people at the top of the mountain sort of throwing things at you. Like it just keeps getting exponentially feeling like it just keeps getting exponentially worse and worse and worse and worse. And you get to that point where it's like, you just lose steam. You just go, well, what's the point? I don't see any progress moving forward. We've done thousands of calls to actions with seemingly very little change. We've donated thousands and thousands of dollars to advocacy organizations with seemingly little change. And it's really easy for people to, lose steam and get burnt out. And when you get to that point, when you get so backed into the corner, there's little small wins and things that happen, at least that help keep me motivated. And, it's like you look across the country and you just see flavor bans and flavor bans and taxes and flavor bans and taxes and flavor bans. And you just go, okay, well, why am I even doing this? And then in Denver, Colorado, Amanda Wheeler and her husband, Josh, American Vapor Manufacturers Association, they came out to a flavor ban hearing in Denver, Colorado, and stopped the flavor ban. It was just one seemingly small little victory, but a flavor ban was stopped, and that is good for public health. And that tiny little victory, you kind of just keep it inside you and you go, okay, I'll take a little bit of good news. I'll take a little bit of progress forward. It's enough to sort of reignite that fire in you. And, Julie Casimiro in Rhode Island, I constantly bring her up. She was a representative in Rhode Island, a staunch anti-tobacco harm reduction, anti-vaping, type of political person. Then one day, all she did was listen to her constituents. She listened to her vaping constituents, her ex-smokers. She spent time with them. She talked to them. She went to a vape shop. She spent the whole day in a vape shop and just saw adult after adult after adult come in and get these flavored products so they didn't have to smoke deadly combustible tobacco cigarettes. And now in the state of Rhode Island, Julie is trying to undo some of the bad legislation that kind of happened there. And now she's a bit of a champion for tobacco harm reduction. Tiny little movements and progress forward seem to feel like real big wins. And that's what I use to kind of keep me from getting completely burnt out. And it's real easy to do, again, speaking to my experience of being in the United States, but when you see people like Mitch Zeller speaking, and they definitely know better, they know the science behind vaping, they know the future potential of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, they know better. And then you listen to Mitch Zeller speak and you go, oh, that just all made me very, very mad. And you listen to, you see FDA's really poor targeted messaging, and you see CDC's really poor targeted messaging, and even just the idea that EVALI existed and important people like the Iowa Attorney General Tom Miller, like Kenneth Warner, Dean Emeritus at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, dozens of other signatories wrote a letter to CDC urging them to change the name of EVALI because e-cigarettes isn't, accurate as to what was actually going on. And we feel like it's misleading people. And CDC just says, no, we're good. That's fine. We're just going to leave it as it is. That is, that takes the wind kind of completely out of your sails and just makes you really, really hyper frustrated. But you kind of just got to keep climbing up the mountain. And, I guess at the end of the day, if you're feeling burnt out and when you're feeling burnt out, and I continuously feel burnt out, it's honestly time, I've had to realize this for myself, but if you just focus and kind of prioritize where you can be the most effective. And it's not necessarily getting on Twitter every single day and getting into arguments on social media every single day, because that's not really moving anything forward. It's fighting little tiny little battles. And ultimately, it's just burning you out even more. Every time you get into a little bicker or a little troll argument on Twitter, it just burns you out even more and kind of takes away your energy for when we're going to need something big, for when we have that big moment or we have a bigger fight or we have a bigger discussion, we're going to need your energy for that. So sometimes, that kind of involves taking a step back and maybe letting someone else speak or amplifying someone else's voice. When I see people like Ethan Nadelmann, like Cliff Douglas, like Kenneth Warner, like Mark Gunter, being vocal and speaking up about things like harm reduction and vaping and safer alternatives, I want to make their voices louder. I want to go, well, if you're not going to listen to me, listen to them. Listen to these people. I want to make their voices louder. And it's honestly a little bit of I hate to use the term safe space, but it's a little bit of like I take comfort in knowing that there are organizations like Drug Policy Alliance, like CASA, like CAFRA, like the New Nicotine Alliance, like INNCO, that are out there doing it every single day so that maybe I don't have to do it every single day. And when I get called on, I'll be up. I'll be first on the front lines. But occasionally you can let other people sort of take the reins and let them lead and take cues from them and don't burn yourself out. Just don't sit on the internet and spin your wheels and just exhaust all your energy on useless little things. The big picture really matters. And I guess I'll leave you with this. One of the things that has motivated me tremendously over the last few years was we were talking pre-stream, and Nancy and I were both at a vape event in New Zealand. And I got to kind of sit down just for a little bit and talk to Alex Wodak from Australia, who's a big harm reduction guy over there. And, he basically more or less said to me, look, harm reduction measures like this always win. We have all of the science on our side. Harm reduction measures like this always win. It just takes time. It just takes patience, but they do always win. And ever since then, I thought, okay, let's be patient. Let's change one mind at a time. Harm reduction measures like this do always win because it's the right way to go. It's the most empathetic, I don't know. I hate using the term best, but it's the best way. Harm reduction saves lives, period. And they always win. So it's just going to take patience, and you have to decide how you want to be involved to help move this big thing forward, And I guess that's really, really all I have to say, other than it's okay to take time off. It's okay to take time off. If you're not on Twitter that one day to make that one tweet, it's okay. Just hang out, go in your backyard, play with your dog for a little while. The world will keep turning. Harm reduction measures always win. Cheers. Nicotine isn't the enemy.
Thank you, Nicholas. I will point out that one of the first drug harm reduction people I ever met, who's now passed away, unfortunately, he told me your problem in the nicotine harm reduction space is that nicotine just isn't that harmful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So like HIV/AIDS, really harmful. Opioid abuse, not opioid use, but opioid abuse, harmful. Nicotine, So, I really like your climbing the mountain metaphor, and I mean that's the way I feel every day as I'm on social media, as you probably know, more than I should be, and but I think one of the things that causes me the most burnout myself is constantly being accused of working for big tobacco.
Yeah.
And I sometimes respond by saying, like, look, I've spent 25 years in global health working on a huge variety of different issues. And when I supported organizations that promoted condoms to prevent sexually transmitted diseases, nobody ever accused me of working for Big Condom. And so there is this thing. So the constant shift into an ad hominem argument, even when I was very respectfully just sharing scientific evidence, peer-reviewed evidence, or government survey evidence, and then instantly like, oh, you must work for those evil tobacco companies. And actually, my surveys show that most people in our community don't like those companies. Like, big surprise, we don't work for them. But reflect on Ethan's comments, because he spent decades working on drug harm reduction, and I don't think Ethan can chime in at some point later, but I don't think anybody ever accused him of working for drug cartels.
Sure.
So this tobacco harm reduction space is kind of unique because the tobacco industry is justifiably uniquely demonized. How do you deal with that? Because you've been accused of working for that evil tobacco industry and that evil vape industry that just wants to lure teens into a lifetime of the horrors of nicotine addiction. How do you deal with that burnout?
That's one of those things that it's difficult. It is real difficult, especially, it's one of those things that you have to let it roll off your back. You have to let it fall by the wayside. You cannot carry that with you. It's fascinating to me seeing across social media in the United States. It seems that the idea of hating big tobacco just because they're big tobacco is what more people focus on, rather than hating the actual product that they make that is killing people. It seems that you can just throw around the term big tobacco as like an instant villain. You need a bad guy, big tobacco's there for you. You need a villain, it's big tobacco. If you're saying anything that has the same talking point as what someone from big tobacco said, nope, you're probably a shill. You're using the same talking points. We get accused of being shills. We get accused of being bots because we all use similar-ish talking points. And it's kind of like, I'm using those talking points because that is what the science says. That's why I'm using those talking points. And it's come to the point now where I get called a big tobacco shill, or some sort of in the back pocket of this, that, and the other. And I kind of just have to chuckle at it, because when you talk about Grimm Green on my YouTube, it is pure, 100% pure grassroots. I receive no funding from anybody. The only way that I'm able to even continue to do what I do is because I have a very great group of patrons, fans, for lack of a better term, that pay my salary every single month to basically just say, hey, Grimm Green, keep doing what you do. So I have this luxury of people that support me to be in this position. So now I have this obligation to use this platform to make sure that their rights are protected as well. Sorry if I got off on a tangent there, but
everybody should support Grimm Green on Patreon.
No, you don't have to. Patreon. Patreon. But it's good. And I mean, that's my privilege that I get to do that.
And support Psychoactive as well.
Charles, could I jump in for a second with in terms of Nicholas's comments? I mean, first of all, actually we did have to deal with some elements of that. I remember when we were working to legalize marijuana, I'd say that the argument that George Soros, who was a major benefactor of my work, that George Soros is only doing this because he's invested in Monsanto and Monsanto wants to take over legal marijuana. And that was like the number one issue we had to deal with in the sort of Humboldt Mendocino area of California when we were working on legalization. Number one issue in Uruguay, when Uruguay was on the way to becoming the first country to legalize. So that type of, bullshit. And in fact, Soros his investment firm from which he was retired did buy and sell Monsanto together with hundreds or thousands of other stocks. So they could point to a little something there, which was sometimes true and sometimes not. But in fact, it was 100% irrelevant to what was going on. So there was that element. There's also the same element, like you don't give a damn about kids. And one way we responded to that is by coming up with our own approach to harm reduction in kids. It was an approach called Safety First. You can find it online, pioneered by my colleague, Marcia Rosenbaum. And it was a whole booklet, an approach to how about basically a sex education model to drug education, right? Which also applies obviously to tobacco and nicotine. And so we just kept putting that out there, just common sense, applying the sex education model to drug education and to harm reduction with kids. The other thing I would say is that in the tobacco reform, harm reduction world, there's really two camps, although it's a bit along a spectrum. There are those which go out of the way to take absolutely no money from anything related to big tobacco, especially among many of the academics and such. And, some of the folks, the Ken Warners of the world and a whole range of others in that world. And even there, you see them being unduly smeared and things like that. And then there's the folks who are taking some money through the Foundation for Smoke-Free World or even directly, where they're instantly talked about as being shills. And the other people dealing with this are the people who are fighting for adequate pain management. As the pendulum has swung on the issue of opioids, where we used to have the Purdue pharmas massively over promoting their drug that was intended for, a short-term intense pain for chronic pain. But now it's come to the point where people are successfully using opioids, to manage their pain, are being stripped off them and oftentimes committing suicide or in horrible pain. And there are patient advocates, pain management advocates, who are being, once again, disparaged if they take any money from Big Pharma, because as in this area, there's no sort of independent philanthropic money, or almost no independent, philanthropic money. There's an organization, National NPAC, National Pain Advocates Center, I think it's called, which I highly recommend. But in those cases, one has to just keep coming down to the merits and the fact that most of us were involved in this before any money came in. It's not as if we're getting paid like a lobbyist is getting paid to take this on. We were advocating for this, and this is just about getting some money in the absence of any other philanthropic or government money to fight for the right thing. And so, if you're coming from the right place, if you're not being compromised in any way in taking this money, if you're not pulling your punches in terms of attacking big tobacco for all the heinous things they continue to do, then, you're good deep down, and you can make that apparent to other people.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Ethan. Jeff, do you have a question for Nicholas?
Yes, I actually do. I have a question and a comment. First, a comment by Kurt from South Africa that it says that Nick pretty much was the one who helped him get out of cigarette smoking. So,
cool.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, very cool.
And another one from Ignacio from Chile, who's asking how to motivate the vaping community to get involved on harm reduction.
That's the hardest part, right? I mean, and it's a big ask it's a big ask. It's a big ask to say, oh, you were a person that smoked and now you vaped. How great was that? Real great, right? Okay, now defend it. Defend it to tons of people who are going to tell you that you're still smoking, to people that are going to tell you that you're just trying to lure kids, to people that will probably call you a tobacco shill, to people that will probably call you all sorts of names and tell them that, you're corrupting the youth. Now do all that. It's a big ask, and it's not for everybody. And I completely understand the idea of, look, I just quit with vaping and I'm good. And I wasn't looking to get involved in some sort of, movement or calling or something like that. So I get that it's a big ask. And I think the easiest thing, the best thing you can do, requires no motivation, is tell your story. Tell your story everywhere and anywhere you can. All sorts of different orgs are accepting stories. Our President Biden is currently accepting stories for the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. Talk about vaping. Talk about how you switched from your whatever, how many years you were smoking and how long it took you to switch, and tell your whole story, because that, I think, is one of the most powerful things that we have. It doesn't take very much effort. It doesn't require you to become a subject matter expert on policy or legislation or the way science journals work and are funded. You don't have to do it. You don't have to be like the super deep dive on it, constantly on it, knowledgeable advocate. You can just be the consumer, just sharing your story. And even that, at a bare minimum, huge. You don't have to get on Twitter. You don't have to argue with people. You don't have to do things. Just tell your story to as many people that are willing to listen.
Yeah,
that's what I would say.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm just going to point something out here. Jeff Zamora is in Costa Rica right now. And, we could not do what we're doing here today without him. I want to compliment him and thank him. Ethan and Nicholas, United States, that strange country. And Eli Rubashkyn is originally from Costa Rica. Is originally from Colombia. Sorry, Eli. And Ukraine, which is somewhat in the news these days. But currently, Eli lives in New Zealand. And I want to now turn this over to Eli, who I'm a huge fan of your science, your understanding of the evidence, because it's not just the human stories, it's also the evidence that is incredibly important in this area. And you know that there's a lot of junk science and there's a lot of misuse of evidence in the whole harm reduction space, also in discussions around LGBTQ issues, which I hope you might reflect on, and in the drug harm reduction space in general.
Yeah, that's correct. And I guess what I would say is that it's this frustration in a way that drive the work I do, because I'm a scientist, but as well I'm an activist, not just for harm reduction, but also for the rights of LGBTI people around the world. And I guess that that frustration keeps building, and I guess some of us, and I think most of us, are feeling that frustration when we see the misinformation, that deliberate misinformation that it's actually in every single space of the work we do. We have to constantly battle loads and loads of misinformation. And I guess that as a scientist, it is very difficult that when you have to battle misinformation, because when you understand the evidence, when you understand how deep is the level of evidence, but then you see the huge level of misinformation, I mean, you cannot just only imagine it's just the frustration that we feel as individuals, as humans. And that frustration, makes us feel that what is the point of all of this? What is the point of even trying to be part of this change? I am really making any difference. When I'm providing all my evidence knowledge as a chemist, as a pharmacist, is this really changing the world that I'm living in? And I can reflect on that, on the experiences that the LGBTI movement has experienced. And some of you might know the LGBTI movement has very recently become very visible, I think, in the world. But as you were saying, Ethan, and was mentioning also Charles, the LGBTI movement has been struggling for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So just imagine the level of frustration and pain that LGBTI individuals have been experiencing for during those years. I mean, and a little bit deeper, because it's individuals that are not or were not allowed to just be who they are, and they were just tortured, discriminated, punished in multiple ways. And even today, in 70 countries, being LGBTQI is a crime, and even in the United States, things are very horrible for many LGBTI people. As a matter of fact, one of the elements that I'm focusing my current activism is the mutilations that are practiced on intersex babies in the United States, which are happening everywhere in the United States and pretty much everywhere in the world. So just imagine how distorted the reality needs to be, that we are validating the mutilations of babies' genitals just because we have to conform of ideas of normality. And if that's happening in the medical world, it's just expected that we're going to be facing with these challenges, because evidence is not always what matters. It is a particular view of the world and a particular agenda. And vaping is not something that this agenda, or the current agenda that we have in the world, is really willing to normalize and accept. So as I've seen on my battles as a scientist and also as a human rights activist for the LGBTI community, I just come to the realization that the most important thing is understanding that we are individuals and we are humans, that we are fighting for deep structural change that we need in our society, but we need to look after ourselves. And looking after ourselves, taking care of ourselves, is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. It's an act of revolutionary love. It's an act of radical love and justice with oneself. It's an act of compassion. And I guess some of us, and I personally must say, and be very honest, I am experiencing burnout at multiple levels, because look at the state of the world these days. We are experiencing a pandemic where misinformation is just everywhere and rampant, and people are feeding themselves with so much BS about the conspiracy theories and cabals and all these incredible levels of misinformation. And at the same time, we're experiencing all these turmoils, wars, and we are living right now in very challenging times. But I want to also recognize that we need to understand that burnout, it is a big problem as well. Because burnout is not in our hearts or in our heads, but in the real world, where there is a lack of justice. The people I work alongside don't burn out, and they don't hurt me. They transform me, they challenge me, and they inspire me for the work I do. What harms me are the injustices, indignities suffered by all of us. And my frustrating inability to personally, as myself, as a scientist, to change the unjust structures of society, as we struggle to find a way to find meaning in all of this. That's why I believe in the power of justice doing, but always understanding the collective ethics of justice doing. Because we have to hold in solidarity and practice self-care and self-compassion. Because we are living in dramatic cultural and social times. And we've done some changes. That's why I like to bring the fight for the LGBTI justice. The movement actually erupted and was known around the world because of a pandemic of HIV that was ignored, because it was just the gays are the ones that are dying with HIV and we don't care about them. So minimizing the harm that was causing HIV was actually one of the frustrating elements that created this tension in society, that transformed those structures of oppression against LGBTI people, that brought us what we are living in today. As a diamond, those pressing forces that are resisting change, those backlashes that are against that change, are the ones that are actually for today creating that liberation that we've been seeking for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the social justice that was experienced by the LGBTI movement emerged during a pandemic. And I just want to remind that all of you, because we are living in very, very similar times. And I guess health is going to be one of those elements that we have to rethink, because it's a justice element that we have to rework and think, because it's causing a lot of pain in our communities, and our smokers and people that use different drugs, and people that want to engage with less harmful ways to use substances that are as harmful as caffeine. And nicotine is not going to disappear. Nicotine is going to be with us. It's going to stay with us. Nicotine is part in the structures of our receptors in our brain. Nicotine is going to be here, and that's it. We just have to be strong in a way of practicing compassion, self-care. And yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ellie. Passionate presentation. And I really loved that. I was reflecting on how in the 1990s, there's a whole nother advocacy movement that we've only touched on slightly, which is the HIV/AIDS advocacy movement, which is huge. And the fact is that it was lawmakers or policymakers and the public's fear of HIV/AIDS, that my little girl might get HIV/AIDS, that helped to tilt. It's awkward to say this, but it helped to tilt the needle toward safe needle exchange programs, safe injection sites, which are now, they're not really fully embraced by the public health community yet. I would even point out the World Health Organization took an extremely strong prohibitionist stance on all drugs for decades, for a long time, until some human rights organizations began to point out to them that there were countries in the world that were executing drug users based on World Health Organization recommendations. And that's kind of like a violation of human rights. Violating human rights, social justice for LGBTI people, huge issues. And in the tobacco harm reduction space, we haven't really pressed those buttons as much as we could or should, because it's huge. A very high percentage of people who are smoking in the countries that have got their smoking rates down to whatever, 14, 15%, are adults living with mental health conditions. I don't have a direct question to you, but I would ask you to reflect on the concept of stigma. So LGBTI, people in the LGBTI community, people who use nicotine, people who use drugs, people who are homeless, people who have it, or people who are living with HIV, they all face stigma. People who are living with mental health conditions face stigma, and if they use nicotine at the same time, it's a double stigma. This is not a specific question, but can you reflect on that?
Yeah, and I think that stigma is like nicotine users, I would say, are experiencing in one way and in another, but there are different elements, different intersections to that stigma as well, because not always a nicotine user is just a nicotine user. A nicotine user very often is a member of a marginalized community. It's an LGBTI person, it's an indigenous person, it is a person that lives in poverty, it is a person that has mental health problems, it is a person that is experiencing multiple elements of those intersecting injustices that are experienced in the world. So nicotine actually is a stigma that reflects a symptom to other stigmas or problems that a person is experiencing in their lives. So when we are trying to find a world where we are compassionate and we understand that human rights are all about freedom, dignity, and self-determination, and that one has the right to have their health uplifted and the best attainable health, which is a very fundamental human right, then you just kind of start wondering why is the stigma is there? Why that stigma it's obstructing self-determination, freedom, and justice and dignity? And I guess there are reasons why the stigma is used to criminalize and to put obstacles on different types of movements. And the harm reduction movement is experiencing the stigma that drug use has, or the stigma that, for instance, HIV people were experiencing. But I guess what I want to say is that not always stigma is something that we have to think as bad, because that stigma often transforms in this frustration, and that energy that frustration brings in those individuals experiencing stigma is what creates these revolutions and change. Because there is just so much that a person can tolerate when they're living on constantly being stigmatized for everything they do, for what they think, how they, everything about themselves. And there is a point, I guess, that sometimes that frustration is kind of like that energy that transforms with time carbon in diamonds. And I want to reflect on that, because I guess most of the social justice movements these days are transforming slowly in those diamonds. And that's why we need to be mindful of time and be patient.
Okay. Wow. Truly, thank you. Those are very moving thoughts. And, we'll continue the conversation, Ellie, in the future. And I want to just quickly shift to Jeff, who I hope can tell us a question or a few questions or comments from the audience.
Well, one interesting topic that is raised by Andrew Thompson is that he have heard people that are saying that certain communities do not deserve, for example, harm reduction alternatives, or they don't reserve human rights per se, right? So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that kind of thinking?
I don't think that human rights are optional. So whoever is telling you that human rights are optional, it's a fascist, or it's a person that doesn't understand how human rights really work. So I don't think there is much point in arguing with this person, because I don't think that person even understands the concept of human rights. Human rights are not selective. Human rights are not just for a particular community. Human rights are universal. That's why I call universal human rights. And I think that's all I have to say. I guess maybe where they're coming in is in a situation where there is an invisible element or an invisible struggle that is hard to kind of like use as a catalyst to drive some change. Because I guess in the social justice movements, there are some elements to it that are very visible. I can see Black people, and I understand that Black Lives Matters, or if I see an LGBTI person, I can see in the face what is all that about. But with people that are using drugs, you cannot really have this unifying element of identity that can help you to understand what we are fighting for. And I think that's a problem, but I think that the peer support groups and what you are doing, all of you, Nancy, Nicholas, Jeff, what all these groups are doing is creating this culture of this community that is in a way unifying and showing we are here and we want justice. We want dignity. We want respect. We want self-determination. And I think if we keep going in that direction, if we keep unifying the community, if we're creating these groups, we are building a movement. And building and having a movement is the way to put a face to the struggle for harm reduction. That's what was done with HIV. HIV became a thing because there was a face that was visible. A marginalized community was the LGBTI community that was being affected the most by HIV. If it's not because HIV actually was affecting the LGBTI community, I don't think we would have harm reduction today.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm going to, again, wow, turn to Nancy Lucas. Nancy's the director of the Coalition of Asia Pacific Tobacco Harm Reduction Advocates, an old friend of mine. I would, let's not say old, because 3 years is not really, doesn't really count for me to even say that. But she's a tireless advocate for harm reduction in that space. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Nancy, and
thanks,
can't wait to hear.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm here. Can you guys hear me? Yes? Okay, good. I'm going to take a bit of a turn off of talking about the problems and talk more about how we can better take care of ourselves. So I've got notes and I've been watching the chat to see what people are saying. So without any further ado, I'm just going to get into it. As everyone has said from the very beginning, as advocates, the work that we do is really hard on us. It's hard on our minds. It's hard on our bodies with exhaustion. And it's hard on our souls too, because of the constant attacks and the frustration. I can feel the frustration. So I wanted to break this down. One of the things that Ethan had said is that in this space, although I hate that term, but in this space, you have to think long term. Okay, there are short-term wins and there are losses, but ultimately it's the cumulative effect of the work in the long term that brings about change. And Ileana just brought that up as well. Okay, it's a marathon, not a 100-yard dash or a 100-meter dash, depending on where you live. So, the steps forward in your actual advocacy, it's because you're operating from a place of it's passion, it's personal, okay? The majority of us who have gotten involved in any form of advocacy, it's a personal thing. There's a wound, I'd like to say. We have either directly or indirectly been exposed to the harms that we're fighting against and that we're trying to eradicate in the world, okay? And because it's personal, we take the attacks that come at us and we take the lack of consideration and the lack of understanding. We take that personal because for us, our advocacy comes from a very personal place. And that makes things 1,000 times harder. But I do want to mention something else. People who work in the service field, doctors, nurses, police officers, fire people, EMT, they all suffer similar to what we suffer in terms of the frustration and dealing with the administrative bullshit and, the lies and the lack of consideration for the, I would say, collateral damage of bad decisions. Okay. So we're not alone. And that's the one thing I think we all need to understand is that we are not alone and there are challenges every day. Okay. The way to work around that, everybody has a different way, okay? But with advocacy and with doctors and with nurses, you can't take your work home with you, which is really kind of hard to do when you're working off your dining room table or out of your spare bedroom, like I am right now, okay? So you have to find that place that Ethan mentioned in his talk about the cutoff. to be able to cut off and tune out, okay? Find what that is, because before you put on your advocacy cape, whenever that was, there was a life before that. And there were things that you enjoyed doing, and there were things that brought you joy. Find that, okay? And do that, okay? For me, it's, I contort myself into yoga positions and I play with plants and then I give them to Ileana to put in her apartment. But, you find that thing that enables you to tune out or turn off from the frustration and the anger, okay, that you have. Because what'll happen is that will eat you up inside. And a lot of advocates, I've seen it. It eats them up inside, and that's how they burn out. And really good people are damaged from this work. So you have to protect yourself. That's so, so important. I want to change a bit now to something else that's going to kind of seem strange, but maybe you'll understand it. And if you don't, obviously message me and I'll explain it to you. But the thing is this, you have to understand what you're up against. Okay. And we all talk about, we're up against, a certain individual with the initials MB, or we're up against the WHO, or we're up against, this person or that person. Let's understand where they're coming from. And yes, I know it's a financial thing, so just follow me here, okay? In academia, I worked in academia. Ethan has as well. I'm pretty sure Charles has. In academia, there is a term called publish or perish, okay? And in order to publish, you have to have funding for research to be able to publish your findings so that you don't perish in academia. So a lot of the people that work in tobacco, public health and tobacco in academia, okay, they got into that gig because they suffered or feel this, they have the wound. Let's just put it that way. Okay. They've lost someone. They have experienced, harm from tobacco, either directly or indirectly. They've lost a parent. They've lost a grandparent, a friend. Same would pretty much apply, when it comes to the rainbow community, because I can never get all the letters in. Okay. Somebody negatively impacted by HIV or, the drugs harm. Okay. The majority of people that are on the quote unquote other side have gotten into it for the same reasons that we have gotten into it. They've taken a different path. Okay. I think we need to remember that. This is where empathy comes in. This is where the place where you have compassion for your enemy, which sounds strange, but there's a reason I'm saying this. If you can understand where someone's coming from, then you know that what they're saying when they're calling you a tobacco company shill or a bot or whatever negative thing that they're throwing at you, it's not personal, okay? It's really not personal. It feels that way because they're attacking you in your most vulnerable place, but it's not personal. And they're operating out of fear, okay? Whereas we operate from passion, or we operate from, trying to make the world a better place and, giving somebody the option to do something that maybe they weren't going to be allowed to do because of their governments or some organization. Okay. They're operating from a place of, oh my God, I've got tenure. I've got to maintain my tenure or my pension plan or publish or perish. Okay. I'm not saying it's right. I would never condone a personal attack on somebody or unprofessionalism, but if you can understand where they're coming from, it makes it so much easier for you to not take what they're saying or doing personal. Okay. You can be angry about it. Hell yeah, you can be angry about it. But the thing is, you've got to take the high road. And that's probably the hardest thing that you can do. Okay. Is taking the high road. Somebody's calling you, these horrible things, and human nature is you immediately want to attack, right? You want to go and defend yourself. Okay. Don't. Choose your battles. Nick brought this up. Choose your battles. Stay focused, because a lot of times, a lot of these people operate, they can divide and conquer. If they can get an advocate to sit there and flip out on Twitter or social media or whatever it is, you see, no, you got to take the high road. Okay. And I've said this before to quite a few people, is that sometimes we have to show them how to behave. No, it's not our job. Of course it's not our job. But sometimes we have to do that, because when an outsider looks at the situation and they see a certain person who I'm not going to name, attacking people and calling them all these horrible names, and then they see the way the other person reacts. Well, who's the adult here? Okay. That's what we have to do. Now, somebody said something, and I've got a note here somewhere, because I have so many notes. I take notes. I'm a note taker. Everybody knows this. So when you understand that, when you understand that the people that are attacking you out of fear, okay, which is a human condition, then you need to understand that that's on them and it's not on you. Don't own it. Okay. We own enough stuff. Okay. We don't need to take on other people's stuff. And that's something that we all do. Okay. And that's why CAFRA, for example. Okay. When we set up CAFRA, it was for people to, all of us, the advocates, to support each other and talk to each other. You've got somebody that you can talk to that understands what you're talking about. Okay. And somebody who's out there who maybe has a different level of experience or a different skill. Okay. And, working together and collaboratively working on the work. Okay. And that's something that I think we need to do globally. And we've started to do that a little bit with Scope, and we're going to keep doing that. Okay. But I may know something that you don't know. You may know something that I don't know. Okay. If we're not communicating and we're not talking and we're not supporting each other and we're all operating in these little bubbles, that's not going to work. That's not going to help anybody. It has to be a global movement. It has to be all of us working together towards the end game, understanding that it's a marathon. And if somebody needs to take a break and a breather, go for it. The rest of us will pick you up and we'll carry you. And then when you're ready, you come back, then the next person can take their break. And, this is how it works. It's a long game, but we have to take the high road, because it seems to me that a lot of these people that we're dealing with, and I also see it in the advocacy arena to a certain extent too. Okay. They're operating from fear. And when people, like a caged animal, let's use that caged animal. What happens with a caged animal? They flip out. Okay. What happens with a toddler pitching a tantrum? If you react to that tantrum, they're going to just keep doing it, because any attention is good attention. Okay. We don't want that kind of attention. We want people to look at us and say, hey, you know what? This person, okay, they're taking the high road. They're being an adult about it, because you can't have an adult conversation with somebody who's flipping out. You just can't. It doesn't work. It completely deconstructs the entire argument. So, and it's hard. But the main thing that you have to do wellness-wise, reach out to somebody, talk to somebody, okay? Tune out. Go cook a meal. My friend Murray, he's a doctor, okay? Here in New Zealand, COVID, thousands of cases, okay? It's just exploded over here. Every Sunday, he makes a point, sitting down with his family, get everybody in the kitchen, and he makes them dinner. That's how he re-energizes, okay? Find that thing and do it. You can walk away and come back. It'll still be there, okay? As someone else had mentioned, the science has finally caught up to what all of us have known, okay? The scientists are now speaking out. We've got Clive Bates. We've got Konstantinos Farsalinos. We've got Cliff Douglas. We've got Robert Beaglehole, okay? People who are experts, people who are, infallible in a way in terms of their experience and their knowledge. Okay. They see what we see and they're on our side. This battle has many different fields and many different arenas or theaters of war. Let's just put it. Okay. We do ours. They do theirs. We work together. The faster we'll get this done. Okay. And I don't think, see, Paul's talking here, I go riding. Paul's a horse guy. Paul Blamer from Australia. Okay. Remember something. If we always talk about meeting people where they are, right? We have to meet public health and the people on the fence and the people who are against us. We have to meet them where they are. Okay. If we meet them where they are and we understand where they're coming from, we're not, like I said, we're not condoning the behavior. Okay. But if we can understand it, that enables us to be able to possibly formulate a strategy to be able to reach them. Because as Clive has said, okay, we are the evidence. So we have to present that, hey, listen, it's my life. Okay. Humanize it. Charles brought this up too. Humanize it. Okay. And part of humanizing it is understanding the other perspective. And if you understand the other perspective, you may be able to talk them around. Some people, they don't want to because fear, pension, money, funding, research. Okay, leave them to it. Okay, leave them to it. But the more people that get on the boat, and they are getting on the boat. There are people in here in New Zealand that I never would have imagined would actually acknowledge that, nicotine's not the problem, and they do. But it's a long game. And in order to maintain for a long game, any marathon runner will tell you, you have to train and you have to rest. Because if you run your muscles too much, you're going to damage yourself. Train and rest. But also make sure that you understand and there are people out there that are doing the exact same thing that you're doing. And 9 times out of 10, if you pick up a phone or you send an email or you send a WhatsApp or a messenger message, we help each other. That's what we do. So I want everybody to really, really remember that. Take the high road, okay? Do no harm, but take no shit, okay? And understand we're dealing with fellow human beings. We don't want to emulate the behavior of those who are against us and who are causing harm. We should cause no harm. And that's pretty much what I have to say. So I hope that helped. I hope. Thanks, guys.
Oh, that was lovely. Thank you, Nancy. Listening to you, I was reminded of when I was in college. I was involved in an advocacy movement then on a subject that I won't mention here, but it was very woke, right? Mm. And I became very active, and I became very aggressive. Okay, I'm a male, so that's what we do. But then I quit, and the reason I quit was because I did not like the negative things that it was bringing out in me. Like I didn't like what I saw in myself as I became aggressive against. I mean, this was not virtual. This was not online. This was face to face in demonstrations, and I will never forget that. Skip Murray has been like. She's one of the people who's, and I'm sure I hope she's listening, who's a conscience in the tobacco harm reduction field, guiding people to think, okay, we should be respectful. Yes, you should respond with evidence. Yes, you should respond with human stories. Yes, you should tell your story, but not attack people. And I, because when you feel attacked, but the thing is, like, how do you do that? I mean, so this gets exactly at the burnout question. When some people have been doing this for years and years and years, and they see the same myths and the same, I saw Ethan holding back a bad word when he spoke a little while ago. The same BS, let's say, that you've heard over and over and over again. When you know that there's literally a bot farm pushing out disinformation on the other side, and I have no question about this anymore. And a war room that's deciding on the topic of the day, pushing out that disinformation, which is like, I hate to say it, but I'm just like, there's no other way for us to see it, but that it's literally leading to policies that are going to kill people. So it's really hard for us not to get aggressive in response to that. How, can you, I don't know, this is not even a real question. And you've already addressed it. You've said be respectful, but how the hell do you avoid burnout when this is happening like day after day after day?
This is going to sound so trite, but this is kind of how I do it. I realize that it's a field of bovine effluent. You see what I did there? And the way you get around it is you have faith. You believe in what you're doing. Okay. So you strap on your gumboots or your Wellington boots, depending on what you are, and you walk through it. and you keep walking because it's like Ethan said, it's a long game. You know that they're full of it. You know that you're on the side of right, just like Ethan said. You put on those gumboots and you walk and you keep walking. Okay. You don't pick it up and start throwing cow patties at people. No, they're throwing them at you. Okay. Wear a jacket. That's cool. But you don't sink to their level. It's the same thing we learned as kids. You don't sink to their level and you just keep going. The thing we have on our side is we have our science. The thing we have on our side is each other. Okay. And that's something they don't really have because it's so competitive, really. I mean, especially NGOs, very competitive for funding. Okay. Academia, very competitive for funding. There is not the kind of camaraderie and community that we have in those arenas. We have those things on them. People need to remember that.
So we have to keep climbing the mountain, as Nicholas said.
Yeah. Throw a rope down to help somebody come up.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, in academia and in the NGO space that we inhabit, and you know, where there are some opponents, it's a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. So for some of the organizations that we deal with, inflating the risks, exaggerating the harms, providing correct information but utterly out of context, that helps them get the next grant. Yeah. And then, you know, and there's no conflict of interest there, but we are accused of having conflicts of interest all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the people that propagate the lies, Troop wrote this, the people that propagate the lies and the people that promote the disinformation, okay, they're doing it for personal gain. They're doing it for funding. It all boils down to the mighty dollar. Let's be honest, okay? They have allowed, they have allowed their own personal ambition to overshadow the original reason that they got into what they're doing, I think. And that, you know, it's a sad situation where you have academia and research that people get involved in it. The people I work with were great, okay, and they had ethics and integrity, and they weren't trying to prove or disprove something in order to maintain their funding. And sadly, we live in a competitive world, and we live in the COVID world where, you know, economics goes to the forefront. Everybody, you know, is losing money, right? They will do whatever they have to do to maintain their relevance in order to maintain their livelihood. And sometimes, and in some cases, certain NGOs, who shall remain nameless, will do whatever they can do to maintain that relevance and that funding stream to the harm of the general population. And the only thing that we can do at that point is to continue to call them out when they do that. Again, long game. It's a long game, Charles.
So I completely agree with you. You know, the authority figures in that space, which you hate the word, but in that field, in our field, are influenced by those perverse incentives. I think that, however, I think that most people in that space are not. They're listening to those authority figures, and so they have their echo chamber, and we have ours.
Yeah, and we need to break that echo chamber.
And so when certain things are said that are demonstrably untrue, over and over and over again, and you just see them and their screaming headlines in the news, then you just go, well, that must be true. And you know, that you know, we creep into the whole thing that's going on with news and information and disinformation. Is very definitely not unique to the health.
It's the court of public opinion. Things are being tried in the court of public opinion, and the people that have the power to influence that, the media, let's just say, you know, the fact that they're trying so hard tells me maybe I'm crazy, it's possible, tells me they're scared. They're afraid because they see the end is coming. They see that they're going to get...
Sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Didn't mean to cut you off. So, Jeff, do you have a comment or a question for Nancy?
Yes, based on something that Tom Gleason said on the chat, he talks about personal attacks and how, advocates of, and I think that pretty much happens on every aspect, human rights, harm reduction, drug harm reduction, or anything related. You, Nancy, how do you deal with that personal attack and how you can keep the empathy while maintaining an argument?
Because I understand that when somebody is personally attacking me, that means they've run out of actual valid arguments. So, at that point I realize, okay, if you have to sink to the level that you have to personally attack me, this discussion is over because now you've run out of any counter to anything I've said. So I take that as a win. And maybe that's perverse of me, but that's how I deal with it.
All right.
Jeff, Charles.
So again, thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
This has been a really great discussion. I want to thank all of the speakers, and we're creeping up on our time. So let's just open up a panel discussion here. Jeff is going to help us with questions from the audience for a whole panel discussion.
And guys, everybody in the chat, if you want to ask a particular question at this present time, you can also do it live. There's a button on at the end of the screen that it says live call or live calling or something related. So if you want to participate in the panel or you want to ask your question live to the speakers, you can also do it.
We can. You can show up as a person in this group, but Jeff will guide us through. We have a number of questions from the audience, and we had 660 people registering for this. So I think we didn't hit that many watchers, but we're extremely eager to have a panel discussion now.
Well, I believe that there's a question from Norbert saying, how can we get others to realize that they have run out of arguments?
So in the tobacco harm reduction space, which is only one of the things we're talking about here, it does seem that they've run out of organ systems. So vaping has been accused of causing male pattern baldness, nose cancer, blindness, hearing loss, gum disease, erectile dysfunction, spine deformities, in addition to obviously cancer, heart disease, lung disease, also skin deformities and skin blemishes, even in one case, amputation of limbs. And, it does seem that they've got to be running out of, I'm getting silly now, but they're running out of organ systems to blame.
Anybody else want to address the question? Otherwise, we can skip to the next.
Desperation.
I mean, I guess just quickly to say Yeah, I mean, it's just as Nancy was saying, it's just a matter. They're going to keep doing that, and they're going to be doing the same thing 10 and 20 years from now. I mean, it's a matter of, one thing to keep in mind about the way things change. When I think about how things change around gay rights, around marijuana legalization, which were two of the most successful of the kind of social justice movements of the last few decades, I think what it is that there's a small percentage of people who are actually conscious of their opinions changing, who will go, I used to think that way, and I got persuaded by this evidence or by meeting this person or dealing with this personally or whatever. And then what happens is a much bigger part of the population almost shifts from one perspective to the other unconsciously. It becomes part of what you're supposed to think, like in the same way that, marijuana is supposed to be illegal, gradually shifted to be, in my country, marijuana is supposed to be legal and taxed and regulated. And I think that's eventually going to happen with tobacco harm reduction as well, right? So part of it is there's certain elements of what we're saying where you just keep banging away. Like I said about Ronald Reagan, same thing over and over and over. And if you can come up with more refined ways to say it, but our obligation is to repeat the same damn thing 1 million times over and then another 1 million times, because that's what it takes, that repetition. And then it requires the two elements of creativity, which is being creative about getting it out into ever greater numbers of channels. So if you're most comfortable on one social media channel, think about the other social media channels. If you're not used to dealing with print media, make an effort with print media. If you're not used to picking up the phone and calling a journalist or a politician, just do it, right? That type of creativity. The second type of creativity is taking every opportunity presented by a new development, like whether it's a new article that appeared a couple of days ago about, how smokers still believe the bullshit around E-Valley and that's why they're not switching, or whether it's the fact that FDA is reluctantly approving something and, which kind of goes in the face of everything our opposition is saying. So it's constantly looking for, every day, every week, there's new opportunities to put new information out there and to frame it correctly. And I think those are basically the ways in which you respond to the fact that they're just going to keep, and remember, for some part of the other side, it's like a religious belief. They don't want to think. They're emotionally invested. It's part of their identity. But what we're interested in is not them, right? We're interested in that whole world of people who, are leaning the wrong way, but could just as easily lean the right way if the context changes.
Yeah. Thank you, Norbert. Jeff?
We have Jan with a question live.
Yeah, I'm kind of a super nerd. Whatever argument I come up with, it only works on other nerds. For instance, okay, an argument from authority is not a scientific argument. That's what all scientists say, and I agree with them. However, authorities think that arguments of authority are the only legitimate arguments. So if you go before legislators who are authorities, you have to bring them authorities because they don't even understand the logic. So Ethan was originally talked about coming up with the right phrases. I don't know anybody. I've been watching this stuff since 2011, and nobody's got arguments that any of these other people listen to. And I think we need to find and conscript someone who can fix our words and then tell us what to do with them. Because the ones I come up with ain't working. Not even on my own children. Say, yes, we agree with you, but that's not an important problem.
What do you think, guys?
I agree. I mean, but each argument, each discussion, each script has to be relevant to the person that it's going to. What you would say to a GP would be completely different to what you would say to a minister of parliament, which would be completely different to what you would say to somebody who is a minister of health, for example, okay? Because they each have different levels of understanding and they each have different levels of engagement with a particular topic. So it becomes a little... No, you don't. But if you acknowledge, okay, that, okay, I'm going to talk to this person and this person's focus is this, how can what I'm saying be relatable to them to make them want to actually engage? It requires work. It's not simple, no.
I'm 70 almost. I mean, I've been failing at that since high school.
Yeah, I mean, the only other option I would say, Jan, your story. You know, the most powerful thing that you have is your story. It is.
Still smoke. I've got a story.
Anyone else? I tried.
Yeah.
No, I'm asking, where can we get a group of people together who are skilled or gifted at this to give us some of these talking points?
So it's a really outstanding question, Jan, and basically, we have people who oppose harm reduction, and we see them inventing stuff, and they throw it against the wall to see what sticks every single day. And to be frank, we have to be doing the same thing to find that language. I don't think there's somebody who's omniscient enough to know what the right touch words are to change public opinion. And I also agree with Nancy that it's kind of different for every listener, but that some combination, and it also goes back to what Ethan said, which is this is not, and what Nicholas said. This is a climbing the mountain. There isn't one magic bullet for us, unfortunately, and there never was in the drug harm reduction space, and there never was in the LGBTI advocacy space, or the HIV/AIDS advocacy space. So it was always like climbing that mountain and finding what works. Think of what happened in HIV/AIDS advocacy in the United States. There was the AIDS quilt. That was really powerful.
Charles, if I could just, Jan, the only thing I would say is, yes, it's a good idea to have a group of people come together to think this stuff through. It is important to realize that how, like in my country, Republicans or Democrats, there's going to be a difference in how they hear these things. It's going to be different whether or not you have kids or not. It's going to be different whether or not you're a smoker or not, or have somebody who's smoking in your family. It's going to be different whether or not you know people who are vaping. So there's a few things here. One of the things that surprised us was that, obviously, to the extent that people know people who vape, right? We found, for example, that when we were looking at who supported marijuana legalization, and we thought that whether or not you knew people who used marijuana or whatever would make the biggest difference about whether they supported it, it turned out that whether or not you knew somebody who used marijuana medically, that actually better predicted support for broader legalization. Right. So there's that element, given that there are tens of millions of people or more using these things, the more that people are out there doing it, and that those people who actually do it, who are actually, practitioners of harm reduction, can well explain themselves, I think that helps a lot. The second thing is we had a public opinion poll to show us this thing, but it's also common sense. I mentioned when I started the point about using a phrase like tax control, regulate, and educate as opposed to legalize, right? But another example, we were advocating for needle exchange programs, right? When we polled, if you asked people if they supported needle exchange programs, 45% said yes. If you asked people if they supported needle exchange programs to reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS, 55% said yes. So as a reminder, don't ever say what you're for without having the clause that explains why you're for it, right? So there are languaging things like that. And the other thing is for yourself. If you say you feel like you're beating your head against the wall, you're 70, you've been doing this, whatever, if you find some things are not working, try something new, try a different line of argumentation, take one, but we should probably allow other people to ask some questions because we only have 7 minutes left and we're out of time.
Okay. I'm just saying, you had a we. I don't have any we that has public opinion poll answers and things.
Yeah, I understand.
How do we get a we? Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jen. We also have the question from Matt Henning that it says, for one-on-one or smaller scale advocacy, when the science and personal victory stories hold no value to a current smoker, any suggestions on how to continue the conversation?
to a current smoker. So, respectfully, without stigma. So, we're often accused of just pushing e-cigarettes or something, but smokers. So the main message here is that smokers need volition. They need autonomy. They need an ability to make their own informed choices.
Yeah.
And if they want to quit, that's great, because then the options include counseling and nicotine patches and nicotine gum and nicotine lozenges and nicotine vapes and nicotine pouches, snus, even heat not burn. If they don't want to quit, okay, because a lot of smokers don't want to quit. You can enter into a discussion about why they don't want to quit or why they have not considered other options. But these are so in tobacco control, a bit like the field of nutrition, the field takes a population-based approach. So we know what's best for those people, and we'll just tell them what to do, and we'll provide incentives and disincentives. But really, when you start to drill down to the conversations you need to have with individual human beings who are using products, like you would not smoke a cigarette unless it gave you pleasure. I smoked. I used to smoke. It gives you pleasure. So, we're approaching people where they are is key.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to meet people where they are, and you can give them the information. What they do with that information is theirs, but what we have to do is make sure we don't judge and we don't sit and try to push it down their throats, because you wouldn't want somebody doing it to you.
One thing that I always talk about on my YouTube is I say that there's no rules here. I try to encourage dual use. I know that dual use is kind of one of those buzzwords that people like Stanton Glantz like to really harp on. Oh, dual use, it's worse for. I try to encourage dual use. And there's this idea sometimes when people that smoke that, I don't know, this is purely anecdotally, but if someone is a smoker and they're smoking and then they try vaping and it doesn't work for them, then that's another failure. That's that's just another thing that didn't work. I tried gums, I tried patches, I tried vaping. It's going to add another failure. And what I like to say is there's no rules. Like smoke, like continue to smoke, try your vape every once in a while. There's no rules. You can smoke as much as you want or vape as much as you want. And if, soon you'll start maybe vaping a little bit more than you were smoking. And you kind of go, well, maybe I don't want to smoke anymore. Maybe I just want to vape. And so it's this idea of, there's no rules. Vape how you want to vape. Use it to supplement your smoking. Smoke less, vape more. Smoke more, vape less. Like, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to try. It's going to be a process. It's not like an immediate thing.
I'm sorry. The other thing I think is just impressing on people. I've said to friends of mine who smoke, I said, they'll say, well, I tried that e-cigarette. I said, keep trying different ones. If you've never tried the Juul, try that. Try a different flavor, or maybe the pouch will work, or a snus will work. Just keep trying things. It might just be that some flavor, some method of delivery is going to work for you that when nothing else did. And so just keep trying.
Every smoker is different.
And I think I want to also bring a comment is that one of the principles of harm reduction is that we need to understand that drug use or substance use is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon, and it encompasses a continuum of behaviors from severe to total abstinence. So we need to acknowledge that in some ways, some people will still be engaged in this use on substances that are very harmful. As they are engaging in this very harmful use, we need to be compassionate, not judgmental, non-coercive, provide information, and even when they are using these harmful substances, there are ways to practice harm reduction. Even with just smoking, you can practice harm reduction. Harm reduction is not just about vaping. Harm reduction can be practiced when a smoker just keeps smoking.
All right, let's hear from Kurt. Hi, Kurt.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic webinar and much needed. I really appreciate it. Big fan to a lot of you out there. One of the things that we struggle with, particularly here in South Africa, is access to a number of resources with regards to data or information. And we find ourselves trying to grab from different locations. And, we just do only have two hands and two sets of eyes. Is there anywhere where we have a central repository of this data, or at least latest findings? Particularly, as Charles indicated, they're running out of organs, but the media doesn't run out of paper or even space to represent or present those failed organs as a result of vaping. So it'd be great if we could have some kind of central repository of data, or at least opinion for a lot of these things.
So, Kurt, so right now we're just talking about the tobacco harm reduction space or field. And in that, there is a relatively new thing called the Safer Nicotine Wiki. So that works like Wikipedia. So anybody can contribute to it. And it has been growing and growing with a huge amount of information. A lot of it's peer-reviewed science, some of it's papers and government studies. So that's one resource. That was really an attempt by people who are not paid. I have to emphasize this. Nobody pays them. This is like a labor of love. And it's grown to an immense following. And it is a real excellent resource. I mean, INNCO has a one-pager for policymakers, which I would strongly recommend. But it's very U.S. centric. I would just say to excuse that is like the U.S. is like the epicenter of what the current misinfodemic. But so apologies for that. But agreed. The original goal of the Safer Nicotine Wiki was to do exactly what you've asked for, and you can contribute to it, and anyone can contribute to it because that's how wikis work.
And I know you're speaking from South Africa, and in the United States, we have CASA, the Consumer Advocates, Smoke-Free Alternatives, and they have a pretty tremendous information library that is generally very up-to-date on all of the latest news and science, and it's all very straightforward and right there. I go to it frequently, daily, almost daily. I go there to get information. And like Charles was saying, it's a little bit more U.S. based, a little U.S. centric, but the science is there. The science is sound.
I think, but I empathize with Kurt tremendously because, the real fact is if you're an advocate in the tobacco harm reduction space, you see an accusation, a harm claim, or you see a statement from a politician, a policymaker, or some health authority. And you want to know, like, how do I, like, Jeff talks about this, Jeff Zamora, who's down there, and my friend, talks about lowering the friction to get to that quickly. How do you get quickly to the answer to that question with, so that you can respond with evidence, peer-reviewed evidence, or government survey evidence, rather than just opinion? And that's something that, so lowering the friction to get to that place is it's something that we're constantly thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, we have
Thank you very much,
Kurt. We have a repository in Asia Pacific, and I know that in Africa, I don't know how involved you are with the experts in Africa, but if you can get them to publish the work that they do and have that as a repository for all of Africa, it helps to have local experts commenting on local issues. We found that has helped immensely in Asia Pacific.
What is the position?
Yeah, we're in contact with African Harm Reduction Network. And the science is very scant in Africa, particularly around prevalence around smoking. I mean, in South Africa, the last real smoking prevalence survey was done in 2012.
Yeah.
So that kind of data is rather lacking. So we are reliant a lot on the findings from other parts of the world.
Okay.
And we, what we do, is to try to create that repository and try to customize it for what we are seeing over here. But as you said, Charles, it's that quick turnaround time that a lot of us look for, as to respond timelessly with evidence and findings of something. One of the greatest things that I've seen is in the Cochrane systematic review, is where they've put it into layman terms, and then you can go to the real scientific terms. So from a learning curve point of view, a lot of us don't have a scientific background. It's just built on passion. Mm-hmm. So there's a steep learning curve, and some of us, I've been doing this since 2017, have managed to climb that bovine mountain, bovine effluent mountain. Yeah. But it's still a great place to tap into when something new pops up, and to respond to it timelessly when it's still hot.
I mean, Clive Bates is pretty good at putting this stuff up on his website oftentimes. I mean, he can be pretty rapid action.
On the policy group, he does. Yes, Ethan, he does. On the policy group, he does.
Yeah, and there's a consumer group that he posts
your Medical
to.
Research Council and your Ministry of Health and other authority figures, and the University of Stellenbosch and Joburg and so on are saying things from a certain perspective that is not supported by evidence. Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Sorry, Nancy.
No, it's perfectly all right. Kurt, there's a nicotine consumer group on Google Groups, and that's where Vaping Today posts. They do all the stuff from Latin America. Everything goes onto that, and it's easy to go through it, and also Clive moderates on there. So if you have a specific question, you can actually ask him on the consumer group, and because I know a lot of people are on the policy group, and they're like, I don't want to ask a question because it's the experts. So if you want, give me your email address. Send me a message, paracletenz@gmail.com. I'll add you to the consumer group, and then you'll be in there with everybody else and the other advocates, and that might help.
Nancy, what I'll do is I'll try to send you a private message on Twitter.
Yes, do that, okay? And then we'll set you up with that, okay?
Right.
Okay.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Let me ask Jeff here, that because we are now 7 minutes over time.
Yeah, I was going to tell you that if perhaps we can go to some, conclusion. If anybody wants to say something to conclude the webinar, so we can,
Yeah, I'm sure there are many other questions and people also waiting and wanting to ask questions, but we are over time, and we should try to stick to that time. So, Ethan, any final comments from you? Because
hey, just keep the faith, and if you're feeling burnt out, take a break. Do something else. Don't talk about this stuff for a few days or a few weeks, and let yourself regenerate. But, we are going to win eventually. It'd be nice to do sooner than later, but it's about people just kind of continuing to grow, take care of themselves, keep the faith.
yeah, that reminds me to tell Nancy and Ellie, you should see my succulents. And I know that sounds awkward.
Sounds really weird, but yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Ileana, I'm growing a guama tree for us, and Jeff will know what a guama tree is. I'm growing our guama tree, our community guama tree. So once that thing fruits, forget about it. We'll send you pictures.
I have no idea what that is, but
ice cream bean. It's a fruit. It's a fruit.
I have windows full of plants that I love, and chili pepper plants. So I do take a break, and all advocates need, like, give yourself a break from time to time.
Steve recommends for burnout feeling bird watching.
Yeah, straight from CDC. There you go.
Yeah.
Aviary or female?
Have you tried watching birds?
Aviary.
Guys, I got to
Okay,
sign
just
off.
checking.
It's great to join all of you. And Charles, thanks for doing this. And great to meet some of you I haven't been before. And I really appreciate the comments on the chat and all of that. And happy to respond if people want to contact me either on Twitter or whatever. Okay.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
And everybody listen to Psychoactive. It is an immensely great and important podcast. Please.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye-bye.
And Nancy, any final comments?
You know, it's. I think we covered it all for the most part. You know, it's keep the faith, and we all have to work together. We have to get beyond our country boundaries and our regional boundaries. Because I might know something that might help Kurt, and Kurt might know something that might help me or enable me to help Latin America. I mean, that's the trajectory we have to take. We all have to really start sharing a lot more of our experiences with one another, making each other laugh. Community. This is how we're going to do it. Community.
Humor, right?
Humor is important. Oh, yeah.
Humor is also important. Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Ethan said, I think keep the faith is a great thing to say. Keep the faith and keep fighting. And also, you know, temper your expectations, you know, set your expectations, realize that this isn't going to be solved and done at the end of the year or at the end of next year or at the end of the year after that, or probably at the end after that, or maybe even the year after that. And once you realize that, like Ethan said, that change is incremental, then I think you can sort of set your attitude and have your expectations and be much more realistic about it. You know, I see someone in the chat was saying, well, I take a break and then when I come back, it doesn't help. And part of that, I think, is the attitude of I'm going to take a break. And when you come back, everything's still going to be the same. We haven't moved anywhere. We haven't seen that incremental change just yet. So welcome back. We're still fighting, you know. So if you have that expectation, I think you can be a lot easier on yourself.
I don't know. I've been watching the social media for 4 years now, nearly, and it has changed. So, and not for the worse. And
sure.
So policies continue to change for the worse in many countries, but we should not lose sight of the fact that an increasing number of people in the tobacco control field are shifting over or sitting on the fence and not willing to say what they really think, but shifting over. And that the public discourse is still driven by a lot of philanthropic dollars that are extremely biased. And I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And that's part of what's driving the kind of wrong conversation in the public discourse. But ultimately evidence will prevail. It's sort of like, I think, I believe in the geocentric universe, but the Earth moves and the planets move, and the moon has mountains, and there are phases of Venus, and there are moons orbiting around Jupiter, and that's not consistent with your geocentric universe. And eventually you get a paradigm shift. It will happen.
Yeah. Look, I agree.
Thank you, everybody. This was tremendous.
Thanks, everybody.
I really enjoyed it. And
my pleasure.
I look forward to comments and discussions and questions from anyone who has been watching. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you.
Of INNCO, and let's do more of these.
Join CASA.